Hello. Welcome to Susie Makes a Podcast. I'm Susie. This is my podcast. So today I want to talk about mental health. I think about mental health a lot, in part because I myself have mental health conditions. I have depression and I suffer from an anxiety disorder. I didn't know this until about 6 years ago when I kind of reached a crisis point. And at that point, went into therapy and I started trying to develop a path of medication that would work, and other measures to try and manage my anxiety and my depression. And in general, I've been very successful using those tools, and I've been lucky that I've been able to address them in the way that I have. So here's some interesting information about mental health in the United States. Right now, nearly 1 in 5 U.S. adults living with a mental illness, according to the CDC and NIH, 52.9 million people in 2020. That's 21% of all U.S. adults. Within that 21%, 30.6% in the 18 to 25 bracket, 25.3% in the 26 to 49 bracket, and 14.5% in the over 50 bracket. So that's a lot of people suffering with mental health conditions in this country. 46.2 of those people have had access or been able to seek treatment. That's less than half for those of you doing the math. And that's bad. And there's a lot of reasons for that, I think. We'll break it down. We'll talk about that a little bit. So more relevant recently, in the period between August 2020 to February 2021, adults with recent symptoms of anxiety or depressive disorder increased from 36.4% to 41.5%. Again, that's data from the CDC. Increases were largest amongst the 18 to 29 group and with those with less than a high school education. So, wow, that's a lot of suffering kind of contained in those numbers. The narrative is difficult to crack if you're just looking at it from a metrics point of view. But if you're a person living with a mental health condition, in some ways it's reassuring to know you're not alone, right? Like there are other people out there who are having the same struggles, and you're not alone. But also dark. It's a dark realization that, there are so many people who are suffering. And this is suffering that shouldn't be diminished as, all in your head. Ha ha, see what I did there? But, in reality, these are conditions that do have actual impacts on people's lives, up to and including death. That's serious. That's serious business. So, I want to talk a little bit about that, about mental health, like what is it in our culture? What does it mean? How do we deal with it? How do we think about it? How do we treat it? And how is it changing? So, stick around. Okay, so to begin with, I'd like to do a little history review of mental health, mental illness, mental disorders, and sort of the cultural history of that. So, going back to prehistory, 10,000 BCE, before the Common Era, at that time, there's really no, obviously limited historical evidence, but there is a lot of forensic evidence to suggest how communities existed, what some of their beliefs were and some of their practices, up to including, what we could codify now as medical, but that's certainly not how they saw it. It was believed, and the evidence that we have suggests that there was no distinction between, medicine, magic, and religion. All of these things were part of one truth to these people. Interestingly, some of the evidence includes a process called tree panning, which you may have seen, but perhaps not know the term for it. It involves drilling a hole in the skull of the subject to release, demons or ill humors or, whatever, insert whatever quackery was happening at the time. I expect that, and this is just my personal speculation, I expect that probably at those early stages, madness or signs of mental health distortions would have been viewed as some sort of demonic possession or a spiritual curse of some kind to be dealt with pretty seriously. And there's significant evidence that they did just that. Going forward in time between the 9th and 6th centuries, we obviously have some biblical accounts of madness. So, the manner in which those people were dealt with usually involved, banishment, exile, stoning, the Bible, you get it. And then moving forward around the 2nd century BCE, something really interesting happens. And the Greeks, who had a lot of impact on culture moving forward, started to develop theories about humors. And these humors, this theory of humors, this theory of, I'll talk about this more momentarily, but, this became the basis for medical education, up until like the 16th century, like the middle 1500s. So, this is a significant period of time. And there was a lot of intersections with interesting things happening during that period of time. But again, the basis, the foundation of medical thinking at that point was the theory of humors. And what's interesting about it in some ways is that there are resonances. Again, the Greeks had far-reaching influence into even our current day culture, and this is no different. So I want to just spend a minute talking about humoral theory, which is the basic theory of humors. So in essence, humoral theory, was paradigmatically overcome by germ theory around 1850. But in essence, the thinking was there were 4 basic humors within the body that included black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. So good. And that the essential balance of these humors, known as eucrasia, a state of eucrasia, was a harmonious balance of all these fluids in the body, and any disruption to that would result in ill effects. And interestingly, they resulted in ill effects both in personality as well as in health. So, you again see this fusion of kind of a spiritual, mystical quality in personality and consciousness, and in the physical manifestations of health. And the 4 humors, represented some pretty, specific categorical ways to identify these different qualities in people, both in their functioning way and in a non-functioning way. The origin was Alcmaeon of Croton. He was a Greek who sort of originated the idea of humors and their connection to temperaments. And it was sort of picked up by Hippocrates later on, and Galen, who took these theories and broke them down into also more specific categories, and gave different sort of species, genera type of categories and codification of all of this information. So the 4 humors themselves, black bile. Also accompanied melancholic temperament, depressive disorder, was associated with autumn and was thought of as cold and dry. So, for example, an illness involving an excess of black bile, would cause a far more depressive state, as well as other physical cancer was also thought to be originated with black bile. And they would use remedies that qualified as hot and wet to counteract that. Yellow bile was associated with a choleric temperament. That is codified as a person who is ambitious, decisive, aggressive, and short-tempered. It had an elemental conjunction with fire, was associated with the season of summer, and had the qualities of being hot and dry. Then there's phlegm. Now, phlegm in this sense, in this context, was not what we think about it in terms of like mucus, from the sinus cavity, but was more just like any kind of colorless secretion. So like mucus, tears, sweat, pus, all of those things would sort of fall into the category of phlegm. And all are as gross as the word phlegm, in fact. So funnily enough, associated with the temperament of being phlegmatic, which is funny. It sort of, tries to explain itself by itself. Although blood does too, as you'll see in a moment, but is characterized by reserved behavior. It's associated with the season of winter and has the qualities of being cold and wet. Finally, the category of blood, which is associated with a sanguine temperament, being one of enthusiasm and active social temperament. Being associated with the season of spring and having the characteristics of being hot and wet. So yeah, that all makes total sense, right? But in some ways, as flawed and ignorant as it may seem, the Greek theories of humor reflects a more accurate context for addressing mental health issues insofar as it recognized certain behaviors to be more fundamental qualities of our makeup. In today's terms, we might refer to neurological disorders or genetic dispositions, but the overall concept that a mental illness is not one of, flaws of your character, for example, but is in fact a result of something up physiologically, biochemically, something's up in your body, and it's not working the way that it should. There's still a lot of mystery out there about exactly why, exactly what, right? Research continues to happen, but it's, again, this theory, this idea was dominant until the middle of the 16th century, and didn't really fall completely out of favor until the middle of the 19th century with the beginning of germ theory. But again, it's a rudimentary way of viewing the problems of mental health as a health issue. And there's some evolution over time that dissociates mental disorders with those of health in many ways, and more comfortably seats them in ways that put accountability on the people that are experiencing these things versus, the conditions that may be the root cause of these things. And that's that's sort of, I think, more the current trend ideologically. But historically speaking, the Greeks were like, hey, something's wrong in your body, and we need to figure out some ways to fix that. And they did that, through things like bleeding. They did it through things like leeches. They did it through things like, hot cups placed on the body. They did it through trepanning, again, the drilling into the skull. So, kind of moving through the timeline, there's also some really interesting intersections between occurrences of illness, like pandemics. For example, the Black Death, which occurred around 1350, and syphilis epidemic. Those later on, like leading in the 1400s. Madness, right? Like dissociative behaviors were often associated in late stages of syphilis. So again, there begins to be some connective tissue to physical ailment, right? Like a physiological condition that is precipitating a mental health crisis in those moments, and the ways that they were treating it, became different. During this time and leading up into around 1700, where you have sort of the beginning of the Enlightenment. We're starting to think scientifically. We're starting to think, these broad aspirational thoughts relative to liberty and self agency and manifestation of one's own destiny, et cetera. It's all very exciting. But at that point, there begin to be reforms in the institutional qualities of managing people with mental health issues. And then you begin to see asylums, coming into greater use. Asylums began around 1250 and were predominantly private, predominantly religious, predominantly charitable institutions. Around 1700, you begin to see some movement towards, institutional or state-run asylums, though still not the norm, and still no regulatory framework for that, like whatsoever. But again, there's that shift there in terms of, how do we culturally respond to those people within the community. Then moving into 1850, again, you have the beginning of germ theory, the beginning of the idea that disease is actually caused in some regards by the introductions of, foreign agents into the body. And that there are, moreover, preventative measures that can be taken, particularly in healthcare, that prevent the spread of disease. It just really started a revolution of thinking about how we look at our bodies and our bodies' interactions with our environments, and started some really interesting thinking and experimentation on what else don't we know about how the body works. Lots of dissections and grave robbings, and Benjamin Franklin was a notorious grave robber. So lots of learning about the body, about how the organs function, about how everything's connected, and how, the breakdown of one element might lead to the breakdown of another. But the brain, still a mystery. It's a lump. It's a weirdly shaped lump. It's gray. It's squiggly. It's got different parts, but they mostly all look the same. We don't know. We don't know about the brain. The brain it's a mystery. There's no place where you can pinpoint consciousness. It's just, we don't know. Enter Freud. Sigmund Freud in the early 1900s, really did begin a revolution in his talking cure, in the idea of, at its very basic, like working through trauma, right? Like working through past trauma. Now, say what you will about Freud. He was a deeply flawed man, and I think did filter, that my opinion is he filtered much of his work through the lens of his own personal experiences, and he didn't necessarily have the most objective methods. But what he did do was sparked a lot of conversation. He started a school of thought, and he had a lot of disciples and a lot of people who saw the merit of his work and saw the depth of understanding and had a quest to help people, period, the end. So I think Freud was probably kind of an asshole, but he did some good work. You can't take that away from him. Jung, likewise, was a flawed character, but he had some really interesting ideas about the psychology, not just of the individual, but about the collective, about the communities, about the social understanding of ourselves and our places in it, and the stories that we tell. So Jung and many of his disciples, really started a conversation, started a movement, and started a better path forward for understanding how these problems can be managed and lived with, which is a big deal. Moving into the 1950s, you have the dawn of psychopharmacology, lithium, other classifications of drugs, and there's been obviously a lot of intro, outro stuff with those different pharmacological moments, right? With some things heroin used to be thought to be a really good medicine for people with depression. That just makes my heart hurt to think of the consequences of that. But again, we learn, right? We're a learning machine. It's complicated, right? This history of how we think about mental health, the connection of religion and spiritual ideals to mental health. It's interesting. It's I think it says a lot about how we see ourselves, in the world, and how aberration to what we understand as normal is scary and augurs some terrible thing to come, some terrible religious retribution of some kind. I don't know. But I think it is, as everything, some kind of a barometer for how culture evolves and functions. And I'm interested in that because I'd like to know, how it intersects with where we are now. And I have some thoughts about that. I'll share them with you. I think a lot about intersections with culture. I'm fascinated by popular culture. I wouldn't say that, celebrity culture exclusively, but, celebrity culture is interesting to me. I think because, it's so full of all of those moments where you're like, what just happened? And I think that it's also an interesting historical commentary again on how we see mental illness, how we respond to it, and where we place responsibility or agency. I can think of so many examples, mostly involving women, Britney Spears, Lindsay Lohan, Amanda Bynes, women who kind of snapped or had very public breakdowns and were just crucified in the media. But there are some examples of men as well. Joaquin Phoenix is, I think, a pretty good example of a person who has, been pretty forthright and pretty public in his moments of, mental health struggle. Ye as well, formerly Kanye West. So many great moments with Kanye, beginning with my favorite of all time, after Hurricane Katrina, where they had a benefit and he was standing there with Mike Myers and, just talking about the suffering of the people in the area who were, flooded. And he just said it. He just went, George Bush doesn't care about Black people. And first of all, Mike Myers' face in that moment was just everything. The look of shock and just not knowing what to do and feeling like, true, but what do I say to that? It just was, chef's kiss. So good. But Ye as an example of, why an interesting, particularly an interesting intersection with culture is that, this is a person who has for probably his entire life grappled with a mental health condition, but he's been aware of it for much of that, has been managing it, has been in treatment, and in some ways chooses to embrace the different point of view that his mental health condition has afforded him and has channeled that into expression. He also has used it in many ways as, a shield, a bit of an armor against criticism of his, unorthodox behavior. He's not ever said, out loud, right? Like, I have bipolar disorder. I can do what I want. I don't think that's the point. But, he has not ever apologized for having a condition that he's dealing with and that sometimes results in erratic behavior. He embraces it. He wants it. He sees it, I think, as a connection to, I think he is a person of faith. And what I have heard him say kind of indicates to me that he sees it as, in some ways, a connection to divinity, a connection to a transcendence, a connection to a pathway. I think he sees himself as prophet in some ways. I can't speak to that, but again, he's taken this part of his identity and owns it. That's a big difference. That's a big difference to what we might have seen from an artist, particularly a rap artist in America, a Black rap artist at that, a community not known to embrace, mental health treatment. It's statistically known that community, has not had the same access to healthcare, nor within the communities themselves has it been something that has been, encouraged, because it's, could be damaging. People can use that information against you. That's where we are. That's the state of culture right now. That it's it's kind of a 50-50 shot in some ways, that if you're suffering from a mental health illness and you try to manage that, kind of like in your space, like whatever that may be, it can be used against you in some ways, which puts a lot of fear into that. And if you're a person in the public eye, I imagine puts a great deal of fear. Not for Kanye. Apologies, not for Ye. He is who he is, and he puts it out there. So, I don't agree with him on a lot of the things that he says, but I respect his mission. I respect his path, to be honest. I wish nothing but good things for him. And I hope that he doesn't do harm in his journey, if you will. But let's talk about the women again, because, again, the early 2000s, right? Like late 90s, early 2000s, you had the drama squads, right? Like, all the mean bloggers and the tabloid frenzies, lots of gotcha moments. And a lot of those gotcha moments were mental health issue related, and usually women, usually young women. And now things are different. Kristen Bell, I think, is a really good example of somebody who speaks in a forthright way. She uses a platform to communicate these struggles and to help people understand that it's normal and it's not, you're bad. It's not on you, basically. And that there's a way to fix it, that there's ways to help. Naomi Osaka, the Japanese tennis player, I think she's been an amazing example of somebody drawing boundaries and not allowing the public pressure, the media pressure, and the industry pressure to force her to do something that compromises her mental health. She owns that. Good for her. Good for her. Bella Hadid is another one. Not as powerful an example for me, but I do think an example of somebody who's been forthright about her mental health and willing to. She is a person whose body, right, her physical frame is sort of her product. That sounds demeaning and debasing. I do not mean it that way, but she's a model, so that's what she does. So an icon of beauty, right? Meant to be a symbol of aesthetic, idealism in some ways. And yet here she is, posting on Instagram some really, really sad and really sad pictures of her being really sad, crying and with a puffy face, and just really, letting people know where she's at, and that shit's hard. So I respect that. And I think these examples demonstrate the changing ways in which we understand one another and the changing ways that we recognize ourselves. Again, I didn't even know I had mental health issues until, well into my adulthood. Like into my almost, approaching middle age is when I'm learning that, oh, this has been happening my whole entire life. These things have been things that I've been dealing with and making choices about and based upon. And, flawed logic leads to flawed decisions. Mental health is a magic 8-ball of flawed knowledge that just, for many people, and for me in particular, manifests as, negative self-talk, manifests as feelings of worthlessness, as feelings of loneliness, of feelings of purposelessness. And that's horrible. That's so sad. It's such an awful and desperate place to be. And it does have effects. It has effects on your life, on the choices that you make. Again, intersections with culture, how we deal with these things. A lot of people historically have dealt with these things through self-medication. And that's why, substance abuse and issues of addiction intersect so closely, as mental health issues. Processing trauma is not a thing, and in America, that probably anywhere, that we've really learned how to do. It's not a skill that we teach, how to deal with trauma, how to recognize trauma for some people is a challenge. Being honest with yourself about those things is hard, and it hurts, and nobody likes to hurt. So you find ways to deal with it because you got shit to do and you got to get on with your life. So maybe a drink, maybe a pill. You find ways to deal with it. And sometimes things get out of control. And sometimes you have genetic predispositions that, maybe you weren't aware of. Maybe you were aware of them, but didn't realize, that it could happen to you too. So, okay, culture understands addiction differently, and culture understands substance abuse issues differently. That's good. And yet stigma still exists, right? Like the ideas that people have about the qualities of character of the people, who find themselves in addiction. I loosely reference the hundreds of thousands of people, of Americans killed in the opioid crisis, which is not over, by the way. That's just a horrific idea to think about. And there's hope, because I think that I do see these moments in culture that change. So here's some interesting thoughts about the sort of pathway of thinking of mental health and culture. Eugenics was a movement in the early 20th century. It was everywhere. But it was in the United States. It started in the United States. And the idea of eugenics, in essence, is that there's a quality known as feeble-mindedness. Feeble-mindedness could be prescribed to people who were criminals, who were insane, people who were depressed, people who did petty thefts, people who were poor. And certainly people of color were, almost 2-1 predisposed to feeble-mindedness. And feeble-mindedness was abhorrent and should be, we had the power, we had the science, we had the knowledge. We should do everything we can to protect our children, from feeble-mindedness. Fun fact, Margaret Sanger, hero of women, and proponent of the pill, the way she was able to get the pill to market, the way she was able to get people to get on board with the pill was through eugenics. She hitched her wagon to eugenics star and said, if you want to control people who shouldn't be having babies from having babies, here's the perfect way to do it. Just put them on the pill. You have control over that. And you can, control which people you want to have babies. So yeah, disappointing about Margaret Sanger, but she did some really important work that moved rights for women forward pretty significantly. And as far as eugenics, like religion, eugenics coupled divergence from cultural norms with both, damage to virtue and health. But under the rubric of, science, which was bunk science and, or junk science, and under the banner of rational thought, of which it was very much not, because its core premises were just flawed, which is this whole idea of feeble-mindedness. It's idiotic. It's the idea of, putting the fault on people who are poor Like it's their fault. We still do this in America. We still do this. This is my point. The ideas of eugenics are in many ways embedded in our culture. The eugenics was not, as a movement, didn't go out of fashion until like the 1950s, which says a lot, and obviously the eugenics movement was a movement of around whiteness. And that was seen as the principal and best benchmark to measure everything from was the idea of, American middle class whiteness, like me. Everybody should be like me. Although I guarantee you these people would have thought I was feeble-minded. Like, there's no doubt. Like, there's no doubt in my mind. They would have hated me. Be that as it may, eugenics did carry with it cultural ideas that stay with us to this very day. If you think about medicine, and I will probably talk about this in a later episode, but there's some terrifying and horrifying statistics about how people of color, are treated or lack of treatment. One statistic that always stands out in my mind is that Black women are 50% more likely to die in childbirth than white women. That statistic is so alarming and should be raising huge red flags everywhere. And you just don't hear people talking about this. It doesn't seem to be a great deal of interest. I wonder why. And again, medicine, has these sort of, it does everything on a scientific basis, and therefore it has these, kind of industry standard measures for comparison. And those measures for comparison historically were all white men. Again, Benjamin Franklin, cutting up corpses. He wanted to understand, how a normal body functioned. It was mostly men. And in medical schools, most of what was taught in terms of normality and physiological anatomical normality was based on those of white men. So, it gives you some idea about how there's a particular lens attached to what we think of as a, kind of a given thing in our lives. It doesn't have a, it's a hard fact that you can't change, but it's not, it's not. It's a human endeavor and carries with it all of the mistakes and all of the biases that people carry with them. Then there's the idea of, workspaces and, this idea in America of, bootstrappiness, like we're all driving our own destinies, finding, forging our own pathways within the endless spaces of opportunity in America. It's such a beautiful dream. It's so beautiful. It's so aspirational. I love it. And I think that we should hold that. Like, we should hold that idea in our hearts. I think that's what we should all be working towards in general. But that's not where we are. And so again, like circling back to like kind of the workplace, again, I work in an office. So, I have a pretty good window into thinking about workplaces. And one thing I think about a lot was a phrase I once heard. I wish I could credit the author of this phrase. It's so brilliant. I should Google it and find out, but I don't know. You can Google it and find out if you want. Feel free. Internalized capitalism. It's brilliant. It's so poignant. It's the idea that, as Americans in particular, if you're not producing, if you're resting, you're failing. That if you're not striving and you're not constantly trying to succeed or, stake your claim, forge your ground, blah, 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 you're failing. You're failing as an American. You really should just, hang up your spurs and move to Canada or something. You're not an American. That's what it feels like sometimes, for people. And I think also the threat of losing one's job too. If you're not always being seen as trying to run the rat race, if you will, that there's something defective in you. It's mean. I think it's mean. And I think it's just, patently untrue. I mean, I think we have lots of evidence just to tell us that it's untrue. So yeah, that's what I've been thinking about. And my hope is that, we are seeing these changes in conversations. We are seeing this increases in problems that people are identifying, being able to identify in themselves, right? Like myself, I had not identified my problem until it became a crisis. I think that's true for a lot of people. They're not really like they're just like so used to just dealing with it, the suffering, the pain. Like it's just them. They're just broken. They're just broken people, and there's really not anything to be done about it because somehow it's their fault. They must have created this somehow because they're selfish or that again, these are the stories that we tell ourselves in many respects for a lot of people. And it becomes second nature after a while, and it informs how we argue and advocate for ourselves. It informs the boundaries that we create and enforce for ourselves. It damages our ability to support ourselves and by extension, our loved ones or the people we care about or the people who need our care and attention and support. So it's important. It's important to talk about these things and to think about these things and to try to understand too, like kind of where people are coming from rather than, coming to conclusions or making assumptions about what's happening with them because you just never know. And I'll tell you honestly, if you're not a person who deals with mental health issues, congratulations. I'm really happy for you. I really am. And I hope it stays like that for you, for your life. But, I guarantee it, people who have these problems and you don't know. They're really good at masking. They're really good at concealing it. They're really good at sublimating it. So that's good to keep in mind, that everybody has trauma and everybody has a different way of dealing with it. And, just be there for them, I guess, is the bottom line. And that includes strangers too. Be there for them. If they need you, if you find yourself in that situation, try to be there for them, but be safe. Be safe and be smart. That's pretty much what I have to say today. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate you coming back if you returned. And I hope you'll return again. And if this is your first time listening, thank you so much for joining me. And I hope you will come back again. Until next time.